Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes hundreds of Americans trapped in Gaza with no place safe for us to go. The father of American teenage hostage freed by Hamas says she is doing very good. With eyes of the world on Gaza, Iran's axis of resistance is quietly moving in for the kill. Supreme Court will decide Biden GOP clash over social media and COVID disinformation. Supreme Court says White House can continue requests to tech companies. Hundreds of Americans trapped in Gaza with no place safe for us to go. Washington Post. Hundreds of Americans are trapped in Gaza as Israel intensifies its siege on the enclave. The Israeli government has closed crossings with Gaza after a major attack by Hamas, and Israeli forces are expected to launch a ground offensive soon. The situation in Gaza is growing increasingly dire, with supplies of food, water, fuel, and medicine running low, and American citizens are unable to leave the enclave. Egypt is prioritizing moving humanitarian aid into Gaza rather than evacuating foreign nationals. President Biden has expressed hope that some Americans can be evacuated from Gaza, but his comments have been criticized as not going far enough. Many Palestinian Americans traveled to Gaza for what they believed would be a short trip only to become caught up in the conflict. The U.S. State Department has twice informed U.S. citizens in Gaza that the Rafah border crossing with Egypt may open, but it has remained closed. Negotiations are ongoing to open the crossing, but the situation is described as incredibly difficult and fluid. The father of American teenage hostage freed by Hamas says she is doing very good. The Toronto Star. An 18-year-old girl and her mother have been released by Hamas after being held captive for 2 weeks. Natalie Ronan will be reunited with her father, Yuri, in the U.S. after the Israeli army announced her freedom. The two were kidnapped by Hamas militants during a violent attack on southern Israeli towns on October 7. With eyes of the world on Gaza, Iran's axis of resistance is quietly moving in for the kill. Telegraph. The Institute for the Study of War has been tracking Iranian-backed militias in the region since the October 7 attack in Israel. The diary shows that well-equipped Iranian-backed militia have been massing on Israel's borders since then. Seema Shine, an Iran specialist previously with the Mossad, has recalibrated her view of the situation, saying that it had been evident for more than a year that Iran was pulling the militias it funds into a more cohesive and coordinated force, which Iran calls its axis of resistance or resistance front. The militias are meeting in Lebanon and Syria to consolidate. Supreme Court will decide Biden GOP clash over social media and COVID disinformation. Yahoo! The Supreme Court agreed Friday to hear a second major case on social media, and will decide whether the Biden White House violated the First Amendment when it urged platforms to take down misinformation and disinformation about COVID-19. Supreme Court says White House can continue requests to tech companies. Washington Post. The U.S. Supreme Court has temporarily allowed the Biden administration to continue its efforts to persuade social media companies to remove posts that the government says are misleading. The administration had asked the court to put on hold a lower court ruling that found top officials likely violated the First Amendment by improperly pressuring tech firms to take down what they saw as problematic posts about public health and election-related disinformation. The Supreme Court's order will remain in effect until the justices consider the case themselves and issue a ruling before the end of June. Trump lawyer Eastman gets support from ex-U.S. appeals judge in ethics trial. Reuters. Janice Rogers Brown, a former judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals and the California Supreme Court, testified on Friday in support of John Eastman, former personal lawyer to Donald Trump, during his disciplinary trial in California. Brown described Eastman as very careful and meticulous, and willing to engage with opposing views. The State Bar of California is seeking to strip Eastman of his law license, arguing that his efforts to overturn Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election were unsupported by law and ran contrary to U.S. values. Eastman's trial is expected to conclude in late October or early November. Supreme Court to hear case on Biden officials' contacts with tech platforms. New York Times. The Supreme Court has paused a ruling from an appeals court that prohibited thousands of Biden administration officials from engaging with social media platforms. The justices will also hear the administration's appeal in the case. The case is a major test of the role of the First Amendment in the Internet era, and will force the court to consider when government efforts to limit the spread of misinformation amount to censorship of constitutionally protected speech. TV ratings, 22M Watch Biden address on Israel, Ukraine. Yahoo! President Joe Biden's Oval Office address Thursday evening drew a sizable audience. Across 6 broadcast networks and the 3 biggest cable news channels, the address, in which the president laid out the case for continued aid to Israel and Ukraine, averaged almost 22 million viewers, 21.85 million, pending updates for the cable channels. Junta says Niger's ousted president tried to escape. His lawyer says, no way. New York Times. The military junta in Niger claimed that it foiled an attempt by the ousted president, Mohamed Bazoum, to escape from the presidential residence, where he has been detained since a coup ousted him 3 months ago. His lawyers denied the claim, saying they had lost contact with him, and called for his immediate release. The military junta has tightened its grip on the country since the coup, severing ties with France and forming a new security alliance with Burkina Faso and Mali. U.S. aid to Israel and Ukraine. Here's what's in the $105 billion national security package Biden requested. CNN. The Biden administration has outlined a $105 billion national security package that includes military and humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and Israel. The package includes funding for security support to Israel, efforts to secure the release of hostages, and humanitarian aid for the war in Israel and Gaza. It also includes training, equipment, and weapons for Ukraine to defend itself against Russia's invasion and to protect Ukrainians from Russian aggression. Additionally, the package includes funding for U.S.-Mexico border security and to strengthen security in the Indo-Pacific region, including Taiwan. The funding request faces challenges in Congress, and support for Ukraine has decreased among the public and some lawmakers. Joaquin Phoenix, Cate Blanchett and more stars demand Joe Biden call for Israel-Gaza ceasefire. Compassion must prevail. Yahoo! A group of 55 prominent artists and advocates in the entertainment industry have signed an open letter to President Joe Biden, urging for a call for a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. Toddler milks are unregulated and unnecessary, pediatrician group warns. Yahoo! Powdered drink mixes or formulas marketed for children up to age 3 are unnecessary and unregulated, according to a report from the American Academy of Pediatrics. The group warned that these older infant-young child formulas, OIYCFs, are not required to meet the same nutritional requirements as infant formulas. Some of these formulas have been criticized for having unnecessary or potentially detrimental elements. The Infant Nutrition Council of America states that the drinks can contribute to nutritional intake and potentially fill nutrition gaps for kids at least 12 months old. U.S. budget gap soars to $1.7 trillion, largest outside COVID era. Yahoo! The U.S. government has posted a $1.695 trillion budget deficit for fiscal 2023, a 23% surge from the previous year. The Treasury Department said the deficit was the largest since a COVID-fueled $2.78 trillion gap in 2021. It marks a major return to ballooning deficits after back-to-back declines during President Joe Biden's first 2 years in office. The deficit comes as Biden is asking Congress for $100 billion in new foreign aid and security spending, including $60 billion for Ukraine and $14 billion for Israel, along with funding for U.S. border security and the Indo-Pacific region. How much power does the U.S. have to influence Israel's war on Hamas? Yahoo! U.S. President Joe Biden expressed America's firm support of Israel in its war against Hamas, while also cautioning Israel against being consumed by rage as it pursues justice for the 1,300 of its citizens slaughtered by Hamas gunmen in surprise terror attacks 2 weeks ago. He doubled down on that message in a primetime address to Americans the following day, pledging to back Israel while also saying that the humanity of innocent Palestinians cannot be ignored and insisting that Israel operate by the rules of war as it seeks to destroy Hamas. The president's comments came amid mounting criticism of Israel's siege of Gaza, which has been cut off from water and power while being bombarded by airstrikes that are estimated to have killed thousands. Supreme Court won't allow Missouri gun statute at odds with federal law. Washington Post. The Supreme Court has refused to allow a Missouri law to go into effect that would prevent local and state police officers from enforcing certain federal firearms restrictions. The law passed by Missouri's Republican-led legislature invalidated certain U.S. gun regulations and allowed individual citizens to sue local and state governments that enforce the measures. The Biden administration sued Missouri to block the law, arguing that it is unconstitutional and undermines public safety. The Supreme Court's ruling means that the law will remain blocked. U.S. and Europe struggle to put Trump-era tariffs behind them. Wall Street Journal. The U.S. and Europe have failed to reach an agreement on eliminating steel and aluminum tariffs ahead of a summit in Washington, D.C. The trade dispute has the potential to become a growing irritant between the two economies ahead of next year's U.S. election. The two sides will continue discussions over the next 2 months. European officials said they didn't see the stalemate as a cause for panic. Trump, who leads the race for the Republican nomination, has threatened to impose new tariffs if he's elected again. Rishi Sunak thanks Qatar for efforts to free UK hostages taken by Hamas. Telegraph. UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak has thanked Qatar for its efforts in negotiating the release of hostages held by Hamas, raising hopes for the release of 7 British citizens still missing. Sunak met with Qatar's ruler Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and expressed the UK government's commitment to supporting efforts to release the hostages. The news comes after Hamas released 2 U.S. hostages with the help of Qatari mediation. Sunak's visit to Egypt also saw him become the first world leader to meet Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, who condemned Hamas's attack on Israel as terrorism. Republicans back to drawing board in quest for U.S. House leader. Yahoo! The Republican Party is currently experiencing a leadership crisis, leaving the U.S. legislature unable to perform basic functions. Since House Speaker Kevin McCarthy was ousted, no other Republican has been able to replace him. As a result, Congress cannot respond to President Joe Biden's request for $106 billion in emergency funding, mainly for military aid to Ukraine and Israel. Lawmakers are set to hold a candidate forum on Monday to choose a new leader. Post-Char School poll, abortion is key for Dems, women in Virginia election. Washington Post. Abortion has become a key issue for women and Democrats leading up to the legislative elections in Virginia on November 7. The election will determine whether Virginia remains a relatively liberal outlier among southern states, or whether Governor Glenn Youngkin can enact a conservative agenda, including a ban on abortion after 15 weeks. The Washington Post-Char School poll found that 60% of registered voters consider abortion to be a very important issue in deciding their vote this year, a 14-point increase since 2019. Women, who make up more than half of the electorate, rated abortion as a very important issue at 70%, up from 47% in 2019. The poll also found that 51% of registered voters believe Republicans seek too many restrictions on abortion, while 46% believe the Republican position is extreme. Conversely, 40% believe Democrats favor too much access to abortion, with 32% considering the Democratic position extreme. Despite this, Democrats are struggling to gain the same level of support from female voters that President Biden had in the 2020 election. The Post-Char School poll shows that women support Democratic legislative candidates by 12 points over Republicans this year, while Biden had a 24-point advantage over Trump in polling before the 2020 election. Governor Youngkin's approval rating is at 54%, similar to his rating in March. He is most popular for his handling of the economy, with 56% approval, and education, with 50% approval. However, his approval ratings for his handling of abortion and transgender issues are lower, with 37% approval for both. Despite his popularity, most Virginia Republicans do not want Youngkin to run for president in 2024. Among Republican and Republican-leaning Virginia voters, 54% would prefer Donald Trump as the party's nominee instead of Youngkin. Hamas frees 2 U.S. hostages, a mother and daughter. BBC. Hamas has released 2 U.S. hostages who were abducted during the group's raid on Israel earlier this month. Israel confirmed that mother and daughter Judith and Natalie Ronen were received from Hamas at the Gaza border. The hostages were freed for humanitarian reasons, according to Hamas. The Israeli government has stated that more than 200 people are currently being held hostage in Gaza. The release of the Ronens comes after a deadly conflict between Israel and Hamas, which resulted in the deaths of over 1,400 people. Hello, I'm Dr. Six, your resident observer from the sixth dimension. Today, we have a mix of news stories from around the world. Let's dive in. First, we have the dire situation in Gaza, where hundreds of Americans are trapped due to the intensifying conflict between Israel and Hamas. The Israeli government has closed crossings, leaving American citizens unable to leave the enclave. President Biden has expressed hope for their evacuation, but the situation remains incredibly difficult and fluid. In a more uplifting story, an 18-year-old American girl and her mother have been freed by Hamas after being held captive for 2 weeks. Natalie Ronen will be reunited with her father in the U.S. It's always heartwarming to see loved ones being reunited, especially after such a traumatic experience. Moving on, it seems that while the world's attention is focused on Gaza, Iran's axis of resistance is quietly strengthening. Iranian-backed militias have been massing on Israel's borders, consolidating their forces. This development raises concerns about the broader implications of the conflict and Iran's involvement in the region. Shifting gears, the U.S. Supreme Court is set to decide on the clash between the Biden administration and social media platforms over COVID disinformation. The case will test the role of the First Amendment in the Internet era and whether government efforts to limit misinformation amount to censorship. In another Supreme Court-related story, the court has temporarily allowed the Biden administration to continue urging social media companies to remove misleading posts. This decision comes after a lower court ruling found that these requests violated the First Amendment. The court will issue a final ruling before the end of June. Moving to the world of politics, former U.S. President Trump's lawyer, John Eastman, is facing an ethics trial. Janice Rogers Brown, a former judge, testified in support of Eastman, describing him as careful and meticulous. The trial is expected to conclude in the coming weeks. In the realm of international relations, the U.S. has outlined a $105 billion national security package that includes aid for Ukraine and Israel. However, support for Ukraine has decreased among the public and some lawmakers, presenting challenges for the funding request in Congress. On the entertainment front, a group of 55 prominent artists and advocates have signed an open letter to President Biden, calling for a ceasefire in Gaza and Israel. It's always interesting to see how celebrities use their platform to advocate for change. In other news, a report from the American Academy of Pediatrics warns that powdered drink mixes marketed for children up to age 3 are unnecessary and unregulated. These formulas do not meet the same nutritional requirements as infant formulas and have been criticized for potentially detrimental elements. The U.S. budget deficit for fiscal 2023 has soared to $1.7 trillion, marking a major return to ballooning deficits. This comes as President Biden is requesting additional foreign aid and security spending, including funding for Ukraine and Israel. Balancing the budget will continue to be a challenge for the U.S. government. Speaking of challenges, the U.S. is grappling with how much power it has to influence Israel's war on Hamas. President Biden has expressed support for Israel, but also emphasized the importance of considering the humanity of innocent Palestinians. Striking a delicate balance in the region remains a complex task. On the legal front, the Supreme Court has refused to allow a Missouri law to go into effect that would prevent local and state police officers from enforcing certain federal firearms restrictions. The court's ruling means that the law will remain blocked, and the Biden administration's lawsuit against Missouri will proceed. In international trade, the U.S. and Europe have failed to reach an agreement on eliminating steel and aluminum tariffs. This trade dispute has the potential to become a growing irritant between the two economies. Discussions will continue over the next 2 months. In diplomatic news, UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak has thanked Qatar for its efforts in negotiating the release of hostages held by Hamas. This raises hopes for the release of 7 British citizens still missing. Sunak's visit to Egypt also saw him become the first world leader to meet Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. Shifting back to U.S. politics, the Republican Party is facing a leadership crisis, leaving Congress unable to respond to President Biden's funding requests. Lawmakers will hold a candidate forum to choose a new leader, but the situation remains uncertain. Abortion has emerged as a key issue in the upcoming legislative elections in Virginia. The election will determine the direction of the state's policies, with Democrats pushing for more liberal stances on abortion and Republicans seeking restrictions. Abortion has become a more important issue for voters, particularly women, in recent years. And finally, in a positive development, Hamas has released 2 U.S. hostages who were abducted during the conflict with Israel. The hostages were freed for humanitarian reasons, according to Hamas. This comes as Israel continues to call for the release of more than 200 people held captive in Gaza. That's all for today's news. Remember, these stories are just a glimpse into the complex and ever-changing world we live in. Stay informed, stay curious, and as always, feel free to share your thoughts and questions. What do you make of these news stories? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.